to me had nothing to do with what we might think of later on as, let's say, an interest in psychology for reasons of ideas or professional interest or any such matter. I felt called to be a psychologist as a way of being a human being and a way to be political at the age of 13, and I've never wavered from that since. Okay? So, and nonetheless, it's been a long development for me, and a long struggle, a lot of phases. I'm sure I could tell you many amusing and entertaining stories from many different scenes and histories and worlds of all that kind of stuff, okay? And I have done so in the past. But just to bring it up to what's more immediately apt and relevant is how I had to confront my own psychological being after I'd begun to more seriously work with that stuff. And now I'm beginning to work in serious gay organizing. I've already been a serious gay organizer I've been involved in political organizing since about the age of 14. For the first set of years, very closeted, until I eventually came out around the age of 21, 22. Then I became a gay organizer. So I was a pretty seasoned organizer by the time I started to get involved with Harry Hay in 1976, which was what directly led to the beginning of the Radical Fairy movement in 1979. But my own internal work, which had been going on all that time, and my experience had not developed enough for me to get a good enough handle on myself vis-a-vis psychology, vis-a-vis other organizers and what was going on that level, to be able to be more than just an individual, participate with other individuals in these matters vis-a-vis organizing. Okay, so I can remember in Berkeley in the early 70s, and I was a member of the first, at that time the only gay organization in Berkeley, the Gay Men's Collective, the Berkeley Free Clinic. And as you might imagine, there was a lot of heavy-duty personalities in Berkeley who were gay and wanted to come out at that time. And it was a challenging but fascinating environment to be in. I was in the midst of my own long course of inner work and then therapy and so on and so forth, learning the different modes of both doing it with myself and doing it with others while I'm in this political organizing. I'm all enmeshed in my own personality and other parties' personalities in this whole organizing scene. We put on these various things for some years. Okay, but I was not developed enough in my own inner work. That had to go through several more phases, okay, which I relate to in various places, allude to in various places. I'll mention some of that next month when I share my paper on Frankenstein, which related to some big discoveries of my own through an encounter with Frankenstein and that journey motif, in terms of my further development along these lines. Okay, but by the time I met Harry in 1976, already I was getting enough of a handle on being psychological with myself in a serious ongoing way, in a way where I'm not going to fool myself anymore as to who I am psychologically, my issues, my defenses. I have been working in inner work solidly now for some years at learning what my psychology is and how to deal with it, how to engage myself on a variety of levels of my own defenses and issues and feelings and internal contradictions. But yet I had not really developed strongly enough to see how to do that in a more directive way or active way or progressive way or leadership way, if you will, in an organizational context until I met Harry. And the reason wasn't because I thought of it in these ways I'm naming now, but more so because Harry was so obnoxious while being so nice. It's hard to describe, a big personality. In the old sense, I think earlier on in, say, European-based cultures, there would be bigger personalities, and I'm sure other cultures as well, but the one I'm familiar with is the European-based cultures, where you get big guys mainly, occasionally women as well, mainly guys with a big personality. And everything orbits around them, and they both take it for granted that what they say is of utmost wisdom, and whatever they deliver as their judgments are just. Now it's a little hard to imagine people actually operating like this, because we're not in orbits of power, like we are now, so strange or anything like that in our current culture. They could still be like that, and I don't know them personally. But Harry was someone like that who I knew personally. And it was very yummy and intimidating simultaneously, because he was a big bully and a big dominator. But he did it with great suavity and smoothness and quickness. And he was no one's fool in terms of how he ran any situation he would be personally in. If he wasn't officially the one like that, he would take it over. And of course, if there'd be other folks like that, it would go on in scenes like that as they competed for supremacy on the totem pole. And this was that world I was introduced to when I met Harry. It was the greatest visionary, except myself, that I discovered through inner work and these odd experiences, which I wrote in other contexts, what gay spirit could really amount to. Harry was the first human being I met, other than myself, who had a commensurate quality of visionary experience of the real truth of that. Not that he had actualized that in some amazing, fabulous way, but he had a feel about him that he really had encountered the transpersonal homosexual in an essential, authentic manner to some deeply profound extent. And I'd never met anyone else besides myself who had that feeling about him or her. And I was instantly, that's why I bonded with him and began to work together in what became the Radical Fairies, which was the idea is to extend that sensibility and stimulate that sensibility to gay men in general. Gay men in general, so we were really concerned with that. So you see what it was is Harry and I started to bond and relate, and then he's like this as a person, way beyond anything I had ever experienced pity people before, but nothing like Harry. For good and ill, for good and ill. It was my struggle with that eventually developed into this discovery of how it had to be authentic in the moment. That's why I began to challenge Harry around. He'd do some piggy thing, and I'd say, Harry, you're being piggy. You're being pushy and mean and nasty right now. And he would just get defensive. And it wouldn't matter, this was my problem, it wouldn't matter how I handled it. And I went through many different phases over several years, all the way from most careful to not provoke him around any of this stuff, to gentle attempts, to talking with other people, to trying to address his lover John Burnside at great extent around this, to build other alliances, to gradually bring it to Harry's attention, and so on. Eventually I began to be the loyal opposition, all of which Harry reacted to the same way, which was, fuck you. It was so, when he would say how he handled division or people disagreeing with him, I would say this over and over, and the core organizing group of the Fairies went on until Don Cleve and I quit. If people got into the struggle with Harry where they'd try and challenge him or finger him, he utterly erased them absolutely every time. It's like they didn't count anything they'd said, anything they did. People had been committed or involved or whatever. They had no meaning and existence as human beings. And he would do this literally with people in the room, as well as period. Chris here got a great little sample. I personally experienced this from Harry, personally, where it's like you in the body don't exist to him. He looks around you when he's in the room with you. And consistently on and on like this, as long as you're on his X list. Chris got treated to this for almost 2 weeks in a fucking little farmhouse out in Southern Oregon while it rained all the time. Took him along for this organizing meeting, and Harry didn't like it, so Harry pretended he literally didn't exist for that time, because he was trapped there, basically, because they had no way home. We got to, with John joined in, right, and it was Don Kilhefner too. The three of them pretended like he wasn't there. It's astounding to imagine these things.
I talked to them and they were normal.
This is normal. This is normal, and this is what I call the law of the jungle. When people aren't trying to be responsible for their psyches and the business, their shadows and the psyches whip up, it's all acted out in the most colorful and amazing and violent and hysterical and crazy-making of ways. That's why I call the law of the jungle, meaning the hidden agendas and forces struggle amongst themselves, and it all works itself out. And that's the world we live in. We don't take that for granted, but it's insane. It's insane, stupid, ridiculous, absurd, utterly wasteful, and utterly self-defeating. Yet humanity, this is the interesting part, humanity refuses to do other than laugh off any alternative to that. Laugh it off, I tell you, as if it's absurd or ridiculous. It's absurd or ridiculous to live any other way. It's a kind of chauvinism, kind of terrible, monstrous chauvinism of the most disgusting and obscene sort, passed off as normal. Now, I do not dissociate this chauvinism from what I call breederism. There's the making of literal babies, the interest in making literal babies, and the whole ideology that flows from that interest like water from a spring. just flows and flows and flows, as if it's the be-all and the end-all of all the wonderful rain and living life that's formed. And it's just so astounding. Ha! Ha! I consider that one of the most obscene jokes ever created by these pseudo-creatures. These monkeys pretending to be something important. And look how they fuck things up. That certainly becomes important. But it's a bad importance. It's a mistake. The LA Times has a little comic section, and a week ago there was a funny little comic. Two cockroaches are sitting on a broken pillar, and one says, "What kind of species was that that only lasted 3 million years?" That says a lot. Well, we're in the thick of it now. Not that it hasn't been so before, or will be so again. But as you see, the Earth is quite finite, and that does set important limits in a very particular materialist sense, which cannot be ignored. Of course, they cannot go. As you see with breederism, has this ideology of recreation. Just recreate. You see how they are? They're like bunnies. They just do it. Since they can, they do. I don't know about your parents, that was my parents' logic. Since they could, they did. I can't imagine anything more irresponsible or stupid. Irresponsible and stupid, and short-sighted and misdirected. But this has always been the way it's been. I call this breederism. It's a whole ideology, it permeates everything. It always has, always has. Now, it's not to imply it hasn't always been opposition, of course, in an attempt to hold a contrary view that criticizes that stands outside of it in relation to it, and is deconstructive of it, whether we call that, and I'm using postmodern term here a little bit. But it's always been that way. It's not, this is nothing new. But how do we put this into action? Only the alternative is going to be realistic now, not the established world and its attitudes. That's demonstrating its limitations more and more apparently all the time. So we must have a more serious alternative. It seems to me, those who feel the call, it's up to us, who feel the call to do something about that and then to demonstrate that. So even though I've always been a political activist, I always felt that the most important political activism was vis-a-vis psychological reality, whether that was intrapersonal within the encounter with subject or interpersonal. Both aspects are real. But that's where the action most importantly is.
Really tripping out what you're doing.
And how to refine this better and better. Yeah, how to refine this practice. So if you see what started with how to be real with Harry, well, Harry wasn't interested in being real, but Don Hefner eventually did. So I could join together with Don. Eventually we tried different strategies with Harry and John and the others, but it didn't work. Became like you picture two polar, schismatic factions. We couldn't then tolerate each other. So then Don and I quit. And Harry and John continued in that direction. We went in the direction of Tree Roots. We started up Tree Roots activities and attempted now to establish an organization that could build this more psychological, gay, liberational process in an interpersonal context, and that's supported intrapersonally. We tried it at that level, okay? Again, it was through workshops, what you were alluding to about Don's group level, which is also very similar to Harry, really extroverted attitude towards these things. Even though he was trying to learn about these introverted things, in my experience of working with him, even though I'm constantly with my process, he's keeping his, always what I might call, later on, a kind of paranoid attitude. He's not really commensurate with me. And so I began to engage him more about this. He's pulling back, and then he suddenly turns the tables after a meeting in his kitchen and accuses me of stealing important ideas from him and trying to replace him. This is when, 1984. And he refused to be my personal friend anymore, refused to hear any position I said about that. It was already true. He was just there to lay it on me, and then he proceeded always to treat me like this. Well, in public, he was still my biggest supporter and affirmer and helper, and this went on until he publicly resigned from Trude's in 1994. He would have nothing to do with me personally. Okay? And his implicit threat was if I attempted to be real about that, that he would be public about the whole thing.